let's talk about these unemployment figures. Economists have said the slight fall in UK unemployment to 1.63 million between May and July shows there's yet to be a Brexit effect on the jobs market. The unemployment rate was 4.9%, down from 5.5% a year ago, and little changed from last month's rate. Nearly 3/4 of people who can work have jobs. That's a record high. I can now speak to Jonathan David, an economist and wealth manager and friend of the show. Hello, Jonathan.
Hi, Sam.
Thanks for joining us. This is good news, isn't it? The figures are falling.
Well, of course, those who want to get work, getting work, are getting work. It's good news. Of course it is. But you wouldn't expect me, because we've spoken before, you wouldn't expect me to say just the headline and not look behind the headlines. I think we have to note that although there is high employment in this country, and certainly high relative to other similar countries in the developed world, the bulk of these jobs are for rubbish wages. It's minimum wage type work. I don't know if you know the phrase "mick job." Comes from working basically for a well-known burger company.
Yeah.
Leisure type activities, minimum wages. Then you've got, in the last 10 years, a rise up to nearly 2 million folk of self-employed, in effect working from their back bedroom. Previously, these guys, many of them, were on very good earnings, 50, 60, 70,000 now per annum. Now they're earning not much more than the minimum wage at about £15,000 to £20,000 a year. So although the total earnings in the UK has risen over the years, actually the bulk of the rise has gone to the top 10%, and practically everyone else's earnings has been stagnating over the years.
The employment market, the landscape is changing, and we have to accept that to the extent that, traditional unemployment figures perhaps shouldn't be such a credible indicator of the way the economy is performing anymore, because as you've described, so many people are freelance, so many people are on 0 hours contracts. There needs to be a different way of assessing people's lives and the performance of the economy.
And in a similar way, they talk all the time about the GDP. Has the economy grown? And rightly so. The statisticians tell us that our growth is about 1.5% to 2% over the last year, and 2% last year, and 3% the prior year. And you think, well, okay, the economy is growing. But this is the point that clearly we're in agreement on, which is unusual for us. I'm sure you'd agree, Sam. the growth is going to the top, I say the top 10%, it might be perhaps the top 25%, but it is certainly not getting to the bulk of the population. And I take that back to when 8 years ago or 7 years ago, they handed hundreds of billions of pounds to the bankers, bailed out the bankers. So these guys got a massive injection of money, and their bonuses were kept up, while the banks themselves went bust. And that is all pervasive in society, and I think it's very wrong. What we have is a cronyist society where those who are closest to the state, or indeed employed by the state, are doing very well, and largely those in the private sector, right across the private sector, apart from the high-tech fields, are really struggling to get by.
Okay, so what you're saying is these changing working patterns, the gulf between rich and poor, that's not something that is an inherent side effect of capitalism in its current state. That is part of our culture in this country.
Not just in this country, as it happens.
But there is a culture that can be altered. It's not an inevitable side effect of the free market economy.
On the contrary, if you look through history, those countries which embraced free markets and capitalism have been the wealthiest in the world in their day. We created the Industrial Revolution. Britain in the 18th, 19th century was by far the richest country in the world, with rising rapidly prosperity amongst everyone, including, of course, the working classes. Then you can say the same for Singapore, which 50 years ago was a backwater. Now they've got a standard of living better than the UK. And there are other examples. I'll give you one more after. They say we can't manufacture stuff in this country because it's too high cost. Well, that is such a laugh, because Switzerland is probably the highest cost manufacturer in the world, and yet its standard of living is a mile ahead of anything else across Europe.
Jonathan, part of this report also suggests that real wages might be falling. Certainly claimant count is up, so there's 39,000 more jobs, and yet claimant count is up by 2,400, so clearly people who are working are claiming income support as well to top things up.
Well, exactly.
So, but tell me, of all those things, what do you look at as the most credible indicator of prosperity across the board in this country? Because clearly you see these unemployment figures as a red herring.
Okay. To answer your question, the technical term is real pay, in other words, inflation-adjusted pay. And so although inflation is low, it's been extremely low for a number of years now. It's rising very marginally in the last few months because the big fall in the oil price has come out of the annual inflation statistics, and indeed it might rise again for another few months. But inflation, A, is not going to get back to the bad old days, and B, in fact, or I can't say fact, but very, very likely, over the next few years, we'll probably have not just zero inflation, but actually maybe deflation. But although we have low and falling inflation, actually, if you look at real wages, real earnings in the UK since, say, 2007, they are actually down over the last 9 years. And that means, therefore, that's the average across the country. That means, again, to my original point, the top, say, quarter are earning fantastically well. Everyone else's wages is actually falling behind the cost of living. And that is a travesty. And again, that's largely due to government and central bank policy, not to do with culture or anything like that.
Jonathan, as always, pleasure to speak to you. Thanks for your thoughts.
Pleasure.
Jonathan Davis there, economist, and wealth manager. Always a pleasure to get his insights and opinions on these matters.